Okay. So you have a lot of nice questions here. I actually didn't get to them ahead of the class, but Ted shared them with me, luckily. And you have a lot of burning and very good questions. One of the main questions, just that may be good to get out of the way in the beginning, is that this issue of selflessness. And the self that is denied by Buddha in the teaching of selflessness is not the relative self. That is to say, the one that lives and dies and is born and reborn, at least in the Buddhist case, reborn, in the Buddhist view, born and reborn. That's not the self that is denied. If you read many of the statements of Buddha, he says, he who has or she who has control of himself does well, etc. So he refers to a relational self. The self that is rejected is a fixed self, a self that is some kind of a separate, isolated thing that's independent. They define it very precisely. It's independent, it's unchanging, it's permanent, and it's sort of it's a fixed identity that's independent of relations. And well, you say, well, of course, well, that's silly. Whoever thought anybody had such a self? And you'd be right with that question, but think about your own experience. I think I mentioned this the other day. Think about your own experience. That is that showing? No, it doesn't. I don't know. I can't get this to work. Maybe Abad can. And if you think about your own experience, there's something in your mind. It's like, like I look at something and all kind of things change when I look at them. But can you make it work? Would that be useful at a later point? I don't need it just yet, but I need to make it work. Will you press laptop VGA instead of laptop HDMI? That's HDMI I have. When we came in, this was up on the screen, so it works. But it doesn't like it doesn't like Macintosh. That must be it. They don't like Macs. Any luck? No. Never mind. So the self that is rejected is this fixed one. Like, right, I just scanned the room and everything in my visual field changed, and I interpreted the different things that changed. And, I remembered walking down the street, coming over here, talking to 2 or 3 people who came up to me as I walked along. And chatted about this and that. And that's all changed. Everything is changing. And my consciousness, as I react to these different things, changes. But if I look back, if I turn my view backwards into what's the ultimate register of my experience, I feel there's some unchanging Bob in there. And it all happened to me, and then therefore there's a fixed thing that's just always me. I think I used the analogy, but I don't remember if it was in this class, of when you look at a photo of yourself some years ago at an event, and then you sort of try to remember the event, and if you can, sometimes we can't remember when and where it was, but when we do, then the moment when we sort of remember it is when we're back in the scene in memory, and we feel we're the same there. But of course we can see years ago we were quite different. We know lots of different things have happened to us. We've been affected by different experiences. But there's a sense that there's a fixed thing there that handles it all. And that is the proposition of many of the Indian schools at this time and later, that there's an ultimately fixed self, and that the quest for those schools, is to find their supreme self, which is an ultimately fixed and unchanging thing. And that is what the Buddha denied existed from his experience. I mean, he claimed it from his experience. So that's what one is empty of. That's what one is lacking. So therefore selfless. Okay? So the relative self is lacking a fixed absolute self is the idea. Do you follow? And the fixed also the actual one is where one is completely different from everything else. So one is in a position that I am me, and then everything else is different from me. And therefore, for example, in relationships, when one has a loving relationship with someone and someone else seems to really like you, it's like a surprise and a great thing. Obviously, all of us were really liked by our parents, or we wouldn't have survived. And at least at first they liked us. Maybe they got sick of us later, but they liked us at first. And so then that was really great, But still, it's problematic because, of course, a lot of people don't like us. And we feel sort of they're sort of strange and different and alien. And then not only people, but other animals and microvirus, bacteria and things, they don't like us, or they do like us too much, maybe make us sick. And so that's a very key thing for the Buddha, that this sense of being the absolute separate self, apart from everything else in the world, and therefore confronting the rest of the world, that self, that does not exist. There's a relational self that is different relationally from other things, but also interrelates with them. And sort of the boundaries are a little bit arbitrary. That's the basic idea. So therefore, Buddha's real thing of being celebrated is not like they do have verses like the great thing, he discovered selflessness, but an emptiness, and it is a great discovery. Actually, it was a great discovery in its context, and even for an individual, it is a great discovery in their life. But what he's really celebrated for is the discovery of causation, of relativity. I think I mentioned to you the verse of Ye Dharma Hetu Prabhava. Hetu means a cause. So whatever comes from causes, what are the causes, and then how to interfere with them, how to cease them, terminate those causes of some negative things. That's what the Buddha's great invention, so to speak, the great discovery. That's what they would say. So here you see someone has a question. Adrienne says, she says, the literature stated that the Buddhists did not believe in self or eternal soul. Again, soul is the same word. Actually, in the West, the notion of the immortal soul, that there was a fixed you that would go to heaven or hell in the future, in Christianity. And then again, that soul is the idea of a fixed thing that's always you. It's always your barcode, it's your identity, and it's fixed, and it never changes. And different things can happen to it, but it'll still be just you. And that's rejected, and the early translators of Buddhism in England and so on, they were sort of happy to find a soulless person, a view that said you were soulless, and yet you could still live a good life. And therefore they didn't have to fear hell in the future. The whole materialist revolution of the European Enlightenment, not to be afraid of the church, or Darwin, not to agree with that there would be a future life, and a bad person would go to hell and a good person would go to heaven. If they were actually, even in Europe, it had to be a good person who knew Jesus. You could be good and know Buddha or know Muhammad or know Confucius, and you still wouldn't go to heaven because you didn't know Jesus. They were that exclusivist, in other words. And that immortal soul, in the sense of a completely fixed, unchanging thing, is rejected. But self is not rejected. Relative self, changing self, evolving self is not rejected. Okay? So that's that. A lot of you asked that question. And everyone always asks that question, actually. So it's sort of the Buddhist view on that is like a middle way. There are people in Buddha's time called Charvakas or Lokayatas, they have two names, who reject the idea of a future life or a former life, and they reject the idea of having a soul that is reborn, or which the Buddhists would define the soul as a subtle changing process, something like a mental gene or something like that, very, very subtle process. And these people denied that. And then on the other hand, then the Brahmins thought they had a fixed thing, that because they were Brahmins they would be fine. And they would go to Brahma, that they came from Brahma and so on. So they had an absolute idea of the self. And then there was the nihilistic idea of the self, those two things. So the Buddhist thing was in the middle. You don't have the absolute self, but you have a relative self. The relative self is affected by what you do. And if you do bad things, it comes back toward you, and you go in bad places. And if you do good things, you go in better places, this sort of thing. But anyway, I don't want to go too much into the doctrine, although a lot of your questions do deal with it, into the teaching. I want to more talk about what they think the Buddha is. One question that I liked, one of you noticed that the Pali text that you're reading, because we're focusing on Pali now, actually, and the Pali text that you're reading seem to be almost like Vajrayana text or like Mahayana text. There's talk of compassion, there's talk of subtle mind. And one of your questions, I don't want to riffle through them, but somebody said that. And that's true. These different so-called three vehicles of Buddhism, Mahayana, Vajrayana, Hinayana they call it, but I don't call it lesser vehicle, I call it individual vehicle. You have the individual and you have the universal of all the individuals, are two sort of stages of something. And that's true, there's really less absolute difference, but there is a difference. You could say there's dualistic Buddhism and non-dualistic Buddhism, and we are looking at dualistic Buddhism. And dualistic Buddhism precisely has to do with the Buddha's diagnosis of the human condition, that what he thinks of as the unenlightened person is a person who identifies themselves as having this kind of intrinsic self or intrinsic identity, a fixed thing that never changes. And that person, therefore, kind of thinks that the reality, the world is coming at the person. And it's a huge one, and there's so many difficulties and things. And then there's aging, and then there's death, and all that suffering stuff, And then pleasure doesn't last. And so that person is looking for an escape from all of that. And then since they have a place in themselves, they think, and they're wired around a, frankly psychotic place inside that is not here. You have your essence isn't here because it's absolutely it's not affected by what changes. So it's safe from what changes, which maybe is why we have that wiring, because it's a kind of security thing, or seems to be. So then naturally those people would think that nirvana was a state of complete separation from everybody, a place no one can get at you. And he wouldn't say it was bliss or happiness. At first he was very conservative about it. And you no longer feel you're there, so no one can bother you, if you follow me. So it's a state of ultimate isolation, that nirvana, an end of life, and then they emphasize the language of the last birth, I'll never be born again. Thank goodness, no more hassle, type of thing. And so Buddha let people believe that who were strongly convinced of this self, this kind of a self, that they could sort of withdraw into that self and the world would disappear, which, is a kind of paranoid thing, actually, if you think about it. And a lot of people rightly challenged Buddhism for that in the West and even in India, that was like a very selfish view of the world. The best thing is to get out of it. And goodbye, everybody. Bye, mom, bye. And Buddha also left his child, left his wife, left his father, and he took off. So there is a strong current there. The essence of the Theravada thing is that strong current, focus on escape from the world. And how do you escape? You draw into yourself, and because there is a permanent place in there in yourself. He's talked about it as selfless, but still, it's and then that puzzled people, and they said, well, wait a minute, if there's no self, then when I'm in nirvana, is it myself that is in nirvana? They would ask these questions, and therefore, and the Buddha was very careful, and I think I mentioned to you before, he always talked about the four formless states, the state of infinite space, infinite consciousness, absolute nothingness as a state. And so it isn't nothing, but it's a state of feeling, like deep sleep, like unconsciousness. And then beyond consciousness and unconsciousness. And he carefully said, those are not nirvana. He mentioned that they are attainable. He attained the top two of those in sequence in the first two ashrams that he visited in his story, remember? And one of them, the state of nothingness, the other one, the state beyond consciousness and unconsciousness. And then he rejected that those states were the absolute. They were not the reality he was looking for. They were not reality. They were special states. I mean, they were real states in the sense of relatively real states because he experienced them and people can. But they're not, that kind of withdrawal from differentiated experience and interaction with others is not the final thing. It's like a hint against the dualistic view that nirvana is someplace outside the world. But he allows the sense of nirvana being someplace outside the world to be the driving goal of the people who he subscribes in his thing. Then one of your questions said, is this exclusive? And are some people not suited for this? Well, yes and no. In other words, anyone can enter that path, the Buddha said, and he went around and he accepted people in his community, it's his new separate community in the community, in the larger community. He accepted them from every caste, of every type, and he kind of was worried about accepting women at first, not because they were unable to attain enlightenment themselves. He said even they were better at it than men, in some off comments. But he said because the society wouldn't tolerate it was his reason. and they didn't actually. I mean, they did and didn't. It was a big, and he knew also a lot of women would join because their lifestyle and their situation was much worse off than the males, because it was a male chauvinist society, a patriarchal society, and the women did all the work, and they were like property, and they were bossed around by their father, then by their husband, then by their son, if they were lucky enough to have one, and a little bit by the mother-in-law. That's where they would have power. The mother-in-law would have power over the bride, over the wife, and it was really tough life. And they would have many pregnancies and many childbirths, and many of the children would die, and then they're pretty worn out by 25 or 30. They would start right away. And so when they heard, if you go join Buddha, the Buddhist order, you have a nun's order. The men are kept separate. They have a male mendicant order. They can't bother you. And you get a free lunch. You don't have to cook and clean and wash the dishes. You get a free lunch. And then you learn. You become educated, and you learn to contemplate, and you learn the meaning of life and reality and something. And you even can attain nirvana. And there's one poem by a famous female mendicant, or nun for short, but not exactly like Western nun. But anyway, female mendicant, she said, I'm so happy sitting under this tree. I just had a nice lunch, and I wiped out my bowl. Someone else made it. And I'm peacefully now going to contemplate this afternoon sitting under this tree. And thank you, Buddha. You helped me escape from 3 crooked things. One is the crooked pestle with which I used to have to husk the rice. And the second one is my bent over old mother-in-law, and the third one is my hunchback husband. If this isn't nirvana, it's close enough, she says. And so there's a lot of that kind of the poems of the Therigatas, of the elder women, the enlightened women, and but naturally, you see, before that, the father could sell off the daughter to make a good relationship in another family, to a wealthy family or something, if they were merchants or whatever it was. Could make a good match by selling off the daughter. There was no question of romantic, people running off and eloping. They did anyway, but now and then, but they had a hard time. And that was one thing. And then, so they often married to some old guy. They were married in the 12, 13, puberty, or even before, and shipped off. And then they completely had no protection in case it was a bad marriage. And then, as I said, all the childbirths and so forth. It was really quite a tough scene, So they were happy to be free of it, They weren't really missing, whatever it was. So that shortened, he said, that would shorten the life of the order if they had too many women, and they did immediately have. But, by hundreds of years, it still was helpful for hundreds of years to many people. It was a kind of revolution, actually. And still, even today, the women are not, their labor is not really recognized. I told you one of my favorite books, Marilyn Waring. I don't know if some of you are feminists. I hope so. But Marilyn Waring, a New Zealand sociologist who wrote a book called Counting for Nothing, The Labor of Women. It's really intense. It's kind of a global study of the role of women worldwide and how still terribly difficult it is. Okay, so those were some of the questions. Then I want to look at the main topic today is, what is a Buddha? What is it? And how do we understand what the Buddhists, what do the Buddhists think it is? It may not be what they think it is, who knows? But I'm just saying, what is it? That's the topic. So the most useful thing to do in looking at this great famous poem is the, not so much, I think we already talked in a class 2 classes ago about, when I was here, about the upset of the father and the wife and the foster mother and the whole society for this great beloved prince leaving and dropping out and going out to sort of get educated, really, or whatever was available to him at the time that was not an apprenticeship. He had been taught as an apprentice of a king, and he was going to be a king. But then he dropped out to go and find out the meaning of life, type of thing, which is an age-old sort of thing. And then when he does, so it was a huge shock. In other words, it was not a normal thing to do at that time for people. The people in the ashram where he went were probably semi-retired priests, They were mostly male. Sometimes if they were married, the wife was there, but then she was probably cooking in the ashram too, rather than meditating. And it was not a widespread vocation in a way. The idea of what we would think of as monasticism, the idea that the society should support a large group of people who were totally dropped out from being productive in that society, was what was the new innovation that happened in Buddha's time, and which he was the main pusher of. There were others too, there were other orders, but than Buddhists, there were several others. The Jain order was the most important one, and the one that survived down until today. Some of the others didn't survive that well. There was one that just thought people should just stop eating and fast to death, and then they'd be liberated automatically by dying that way. And they naturally didn't last that long. They were not long lasting. And there were others that had other various kinds of views. So in book 13 of this one, it's kind of fun when Buddha decides he's really going to go for it, and that he was overdoing it by torturing himself, and he's feeling a little healthier. But actually he did learn a lot by sort of doing without everything. He learned a lot about the nature of life, learned about the nature of his body. So now he's come and he's sitting under the tree, and he's approached by the devil. And this is actually rather similar to Christ. Actually, there's a book study by Hajime Nakamura, a Japanese Buddhist scholar, which studies the life of the Buddha, and he finds, looking at the Gospels and the apocryphal Gospels, he found 22 different incidents in the Buddha's life and in the life of Jesus. If you add in the apocryphal, not the four major ones, but there are another half a dozen of them, and you add all of them together, and you have all these incidents in Jesus' life that are parallel, but slightly different always with Buddha's life. There are 22 different ones. And the conception, the fatherless conception is one thing, for example, and the being in a situation where there was something special about their birth, where therefore they had to be sequestered in a particular way. In the case of Jesus, he had to flee, his parents did, and in the case of Buddha, he had to be isolated from the society. So, and then third, one of his favorite ones is when the father takes Buddha to see the gods in the temple of the Vedic gods, and there are these statues in the temple. The statues come to life, and they go over and they bow to the Buddha and smile, I guess, and pat him on the head or something, and then they don't specify, and then go back and step on their pedestals and turn back into statues. In the case of Jesus, he's taken by Joseph and Mary in one of the apocryphal Gospels to an Egyptian temple with all the local deities there, and instantly they're all pulverized. They all explode. So it's a little more Middle Eastern style than Indian style. They don't get back on their pedestals; they blow up. And going down through the whole thing, there's all these different parallels. And a big parallel is the conversation between Jesus and Satan, and between Buddha and Mara, as they called Satan. But the Satan of the Buddhists, Mara he's called, he's more like, he's not sort of a weirdo like Beelzebub or something with horns and down in hell, all scaly looking and weird, like you have images in Disney and things about devils. He's actually sort of more like a kind of he's a fashionista. He's sort of a little bit like a pimp or something, and he has a heaven of pleasure actually, and he's a celestial type, and he has 3 daughters: lust, delight, and thirst. He has sons: confusion, gaiety, and pride. In other words, he's trying to lure Buddha first into a party. And he's like Cupid. He has the role of Cupid. He has a bow and arrow where he shoots an arrow, and when it hits you, then you've become obsessed with whoever you look at. And so he's a big enemy of the celibate monastics, the monks and nuns who are sublimating their sexuality in sexual energies in a contemplative way. And so he gets mad. He was very upset. He was depressed. Kamadeva, here on page 137, and he says, "This sage," he's referring to Buddha because he knows he's a deity, so he knows about Buddha. He's a demonic deity. He says, "This sage, wearing the armor of resolution, having drawn the arrow of wisdom with the barb of truth, sits yonder intending to conquer my realms." That is the world which I have people controlled by their lust and by their fear and hatred and their delusion. So therefore I am depressed, hence this despondency of my mind. If he succeeds in overcoming me and proclaims to the world the path of final bliss, all this my realm will today become empty, as did that of the disembodied Lord when he violated the rules of his station. And that's a reference to another time when he was trying to make Shiva. He refers to a Indian myth, where he was trying to get Shiva to come out of his meditation, because Shiva was mad because his wife had died in some way. The gods had offended him, and in honor of him, she threw herself into a fire. And he was very angry, so he went into big meditation, and he was generating so much heat from his meditation that the gods were afraid the world would be destroyed. So they hired Cupid, Kama, to come and shoot him with an arrow, and then they were bringing before him the reborn goddess who was his wife in the previous life, and then thinking he would open his eyes from the meditation, see her, fall in love, and quit meditating. But he knew that they were coming, so he incinerated the Cupid figure, the Kama, and he's therefore called the bodiless Lord. He's still there, but he doesn't have a body. Makes him actually more sneaky. But by this time, he's having a body again. So it refers to a Hindu myth, a poem, anyway. While therefore he stands within my reach, and while his spiritual eyesight is not yet attained, I will assail him to break his vow, as the swollen might of a river assails a dam. Then, having seized his flower-made bow and his 5 infatuating arrows, he drew near to the root of the aswata tree. That's the fig tree that Buddha is, Bodhi tree that he was sitting under, with his children, he, the great disturber of the minds of living beings. Having fixed his left hand on the end of the barb, and playing with the arrow, Mara thus addressed the calm seer as he sat on his seat, preparing to cross to the further side of the ocean of existence. Up, up, thou, O thou Kshatriya, afraid of death. Follow thine own duty and abandon this law of this truth of liberation. Again, law is a mistranslation. Law of liberation, but never mind. And having conquered the lower worlds by thy arrows, proceed to gain the higher worlds of Indra. That is a glorious path to travel, because the Indians are already aware of the power of contemplation, of withdrawal, and they think they do it for power and to become a god. That's what the other yogis were doing. So he's trying to get him to do that, because that will put him back in the paths of desire, you see, and anger, and all the addictive emotions. That is a glorious path to travel, which has been followed by former leaders of men. This mendicant life is ill-suited for one born in the noble family of a royal sage. But if thou wilt not rise, strong in thy purpose, then be firm if thou wilt, and quit not thy resolve. This arrow is uplifted by me. It is the very one which was shot against Suryaka, the enemy of the fish. Just another myth. And he goes on like that, and he challenges and threatens the Buddha. And then the Buddha did not even move an inch, so he shot the arrow at him. But when the arrow was shot, the Buddha still sat there, and then the arrow just fell down as a flower at his feet, is the idea. So then he tries to have him seduced by his daughters, and that also fails. Then he calls a hostile army, and they come and fight with him. And this is because every Indian classic epic poem has to have a battle scene. So this is the battle scene. And it's pretty intense special effects, the battle that they do. But they never get anywhere. They can't deal with it. He just has a force field around him, and he doesn't do anything. And then the Buddha achieved a certain meditation. There's another thing. Maybe they don't have that in this version. And the other gods tell him to forget about the devil. And he doesn't have a conversation. Actually, the last thing Mara did, usually in most of the stories, in Buddha's autobiography, which he has in the Mahayana, he has called Lalita Vistara, an autobiography. And in the autobiography, the Buddha says, he came to me and he said, who asked you to be a Buddha? What is this Buddha? Everybody's going to be enlightened. You're going to save beings from suffering. Like, who asked you? By what right do you say you're going to be a Buddha? And karmic, in evolutionary causality. And Buddha said, well, how did you get to be king of the Maras, the king devil? Because you were kind and compassionate when you were in a hell somewhere to someone. And by that virtue, that tiny little bird, you gave someone like a little sip of water. And by that tiny little virtue, eventually, after many, many aeons of lifetimes, you became king of the devils. So I did so many good things for other beings. I gave my life, my body, my property, my wives, my children, my kingdom, my limbs, my eyes. I gave to all the beings many, many lifetimes. And now I'm going to be a Buddha and help everybody. My final gift to all beings will be to help them attain freedom from suffering. And then, so then the devil said to him, well, you're my witness because you're clairvoyant and you remember that I did such and such in a previous life. But who could possibly be your witness of all these huge number of things that you say you did? Says the devil. And then the Buddha, that's why you see a Buddha, he sits cross-legged, right, in his statues, and he has one hand like this. His right hand is down like that. It's called the earth-touching gesture. And what it is he calls the Mother Earth, who's Persephone, actually. But in Sanskrit, it's Prithvi. It sounds very similar to Persephone, and it's as it is. Because these are the same as the Greek gods, actually. The Indian gods are, a lot of them. And like Zeus is Dyaus in Sanskrit. It means the sky. Anyway, he puts his hand down there, and then the mother, the earth goddess comes up, and she starts reciting Buddha's former lives to the devil. And the devil goes, drat, and he goes back to his heaven and thinks of how to cause more trouble for the Buddhist order later. So anyway, that's it. But he doesn't have that conversation, but I like that conversation. It's like, what's your right? And touching the earth shows the Buddha's connection to nature, which is a really very important thing. And it undercuts the idea of the Buddha as, and the message being you have to leave life and destroy it, even though they say that a lot, especially in the Theravada literature. They talk a lot about, less than my last birth, I won't be born again, I've accomplished my duty, all this kind of thing. So then the next thing is, then having conquered the host of Mara, he, the great master of meditation, set himself to meditate, longing to know the supreme end. And having attained the highest mastery in all kinds of meditation, he remembered in the first watch the continuous series of all his former births. And it's interesting, they don't have a word like us. They do have a word lifespan, but the way they refer to life is as a birth, like I had this birth, that birth, the other birth. So they use the word for birth to refer to the whole life. And therefore, when we say life, we mean lifespan, like a duration between birth and death. But they refer to that span as birth, just a birth. So he says, in such a place, he remembered them all. And then in such a place I was so-and-so by name, and from thence I passed and came hither. And thus he remembered his thousands of births, experiencing each as if it were over again. And having remembered each birth and each death and all those various transmigrations, the compassionate one then felt compassion for all living beings. Oh, it's good that he says that. Usually they don't emphasize that fact, but you see, they say that because, why? If you remembered all previous lives, and they were beginningless and infinite, which is a very important point I'm going to make today, I'm going to emphasize, then you were involved with every other being at different times. Because they also are beginningless lives, but they don't remember them. And why don't we remember? Well, that's another story. I won't jump to there. But so therefore, you remember you were entangled with all beings infinite times. And therefore, given infinity, you can't say that you weren't related to everyone in a deep, like a deep kin. You were enemies too, of them, and they of you. But you all had the most intimate relationships with each other, with every single being in the universe. And the way they do that is they say all beings were your mother at some time, because the mother is the most positive way of relating, because then she has to work for you full time, And she gives you a house for 9 months, and then she works for you all the time until you become an adolescent. And you say, "This is my life, Mom." Forget about it. But otherwise, moms really do it, As the Louis C.K. famously said. I shouldn't digress. Okay, so then he saw, and he felt terribly sad, and he saw the whole world as in a spotless mirror. And he saw all the beings, how they had been. And those living beings, under the influence of evil actions, pass into wretched worlds. These others, under the influence of good actions, go forward in heaven. The one being born in a dreadful hell, full of terrors, are miserably tortured at last by many kinds of suffering. Some are made to drink molten iron of the color of fire. Others are lifted aloft screaming on a red-hot iron pillar. Others are baked like flour, thrown with their heads downward into iron jars. It's just too horrible even to read. The very, very vivid descriptions of the hells. And then there's 32 major hells: cold, hot, crushing, and cutting. They're very physical. There's a few psychological ones, for isolated, depression, things like that, but it's really terrible. Then he goes on through all the different types of life forms. The pretas are a particularly bad one that we don't know about. They're sort of worse than insects, I'm saying. They're worse. They have a really horrible time, and they're always unsatisfied. They're incarnations of hunger and thirst, you could say. And extreme, like some being that has a belly the size of Yankee Stadium. They have a throat as long as the subway reaching down to the Battery, except it's only the pin can go through it. And then a tiny little mouth that's that far away from the giant belly. And then they find a little moisture or a little something, a little nourishment, and then it has to go down this long throat. It burns all the way down the throat, and then it falls into a vast belly, and then it burns like fire in the belly. It's like horrendous descriptions. Actually, the Buddha has told his monks, don't contemplate the hells too much, because you'll become too depressed and freaked out, he said. And the Christians and other religions also freak people out with this kind of thing. And then the gods, and the more difficult is the suffering of the gods. And apparently the gods are really having a happy time. There are 23 different layers of the gods, starting in the 6 desire realm gods, as they're called, which are really super party animals, all of them. And in fact, the top 2 levels of the desire realm gods, the next to the top one is one called Nirmana Rati, which means one who enjoys whatever they fantasize. So it's like any fantasy is completely enjoy it. You just think it and you have the pleasure, or whatever it may be. It doesn't matter what it is. And then the next one up is called Paranimita Vashavartan, which means one who controls the fantasies of others, or who interfere, or who participates in the fantasies of others, because they're so jaded by that time that they can't have any fantasies. So they just are a voyeur like heaven, where they interfere, they participate in other beings' fantasies and pleasures. And so they're very elaborately described in India. They're the pleasure realms. And then the suffering, though, of the gods in those realms, which at first seems to be that they're not suffering, but is terrible, apparently, because they become so indulged in their pleasures that when they leave and when they die, because they are impermanent, because they're causal beings, because they're made of parts and pieces and action and karma and evolution, and then when they die, it's just so agonizing that it makes the whole time they spent in pleasure, even 1,000 years, to be like a total nightmare. And he describes that type of thing. And then he comes finally to the perfect knowledge. So after remembering, and some of the modern Buddhists try to avoid that thing about the former and future lives, and they kind of act like that's not necessary, that's just an old-fashioned thing, and so forth. And that is very, very mistaken, because it's absolutely part of his final thing. Then he attains nirvana, which they call the termination of a contamination, or contaminants, which means any kind of negative drive or emotion at the either subconscious or instinctual level, as well as the conscious level. And that's what Buddha is. And when he does that, he feels, of course, totally happy. He feels that that's the reality. That is a kind of happiness, bliss, pleasure that is not circumstantial. It's not dependent on circumstances. It is the nature of reality itself. He argues, or he says, he teaches, and but that is in the context of him previously feeling interconnected with all life, actually. So that's right. That in itself is the seed of the universal vehicle, the fact that he is interconnected with all beings. And yet he somehow feels that the reality of himself and all the beings is this freedom from suffering. But then he sees the beings as caught and trapped in the suffering because they don't know that they're free. So that's a complicated understanding. Enlightened people always think of enlightenment as, and a little bit Theravada presents it as if it was sort of some simple thing. Like you just go somewhere and you're in the cosmic freezer or something, or in the cosmic whatever, and you don't feel anything and you don't have any negative feeling, therefore. So it's sort of a little bit like an obliteration. And he lets it seem like that for those who are more freaked out, which I think are his initial Brahminical male, mostly male disciples, who have a strong sense of being that isolated self. It's like the paradise of the isolated self, they think. But of course, when they get to that kind of a state, then they realize that they don't need so much to be so isolated. They don't have such a strong craving to be isolated. Okay, so those are very important passages to read, and there are various different other versions of it. And then I have a thing outline which I wanted to put there, but I couldn't. So when we ask the question, what is a Buddha? It only is meaningful for the Buddhists, including the Hinayana ones or Theravada individual vehicle ones, if we understand the Buddhist view of the world, what it is. And here, to our shock, we remember I mentioned to you already, Buddha is celebrated as discoverer of causation, and therefore is taking the power away from the gods in his worldview. I mean, who knows if he's correct or not correct, or maybe there are no gods. I'm not saying what the Buddhist view is the correct view. I'm just saying this is what they thought, what he thought, and what then Buddhists thought. And so the life that he, as you know, a conventional life or relative life, is a circle of living forms. From the heavens, there's said to be 6, sometimes 5, but sometimes 6 main sort of species of beings, let's say, within each of which there's many subspecies. And these 6 are the gods, and then the anti-gods, and that's why there's only 5 sometimes, because the anti-gods are sometimes just thought of as angry gods, pleasure-seeking gods and angry gods as 2 types. And sometimes they're thought of 2 different things, and I call them titans. It fits with the Greek idea of the very quarrelsome sort of warrior-type gods, as opposed to those who are more peaceful and are just into more pleasure and so on. So there's gods and anti-gods. Then humans, the ones just beneath the gods. Then there are the non-human animals, or beasts, I guess we could say, and who don't have language, and etc., and who are more hardwired to fit into their niche, evolutionary niche. Then there are this weird creature called pretans, which people translate as hungry ghosts, but they're not ghosts, actually. They're born beings, and they're stuck in these awful lives. I mean, they seem like hell in itself, their lives, but then they're hell beings. So those are the 6 types. And they say that the unreflective person, and all persons who are not enlightened, have been in this cycle and have been gods and have been hell beings and have been animals and humans again previously, and titans and pretans and every single thing we've all been, they say, they think, and they just cycle through this thing. And that's the samsara. That's called the cycle. It just goes round and round, and it's meaningless in a way, pointless. And you're driven helplessly by your inner instincts and by circumstances of your environments, and your main drives, they usually show a fierce-looking deity, which is Yama, the god of death, holding with claws and clawed feet and his teeth a round circle that has these 6 divisions. They show that. And then in the center of that, there's like a space, and in that space there's a cock and a snake and a pig. And they symbolize lust, hate, and delusion. And those are the driving energies of this world system, you could say. And it's a pretty wretched system. The gods, of course, are cheery, and even humans can be kind of cheery. But then, unfortunately, the way they pass away is so bad, it makes all the cheeriness useless, type of thing. So that's what first of all, that's how they see the life. Then second, Buddhahood, in relation to that life, represents the being that has gotten off of that wheel, is no longer driven involuntarily in that wheel, and yet is present to the whole wheel, at least by the Mahayana. But the individual vehicle, the Theravada, and there are other branches of individual vehicle than the Theravada, but that's the one that survived today so strongly. But for the Theravada, the Buddha is just out of the wheel. They don't emphasize that he's sort of involved in the whole wheel. Also, he's still present in the wheel, even though he's present to them, who are humans in the wheel, and gives them teaching. And then when asked, they say, well, he's just a luckier. He has like more good karma than we do. The ones who are called arhats, who are also off the wheel, but they don't have the teaching ability and the special signs of the Buddha. So the Buddha is like the summit of that evolution. It's like what really everybody really wants. In other words, all beings: permanent contentment, permanent bliss, and then permanent love of all other beings, therefore, without any exception. But that aspect is not emphasized in the Theravada, which just, that's why I call it individual vehicle, because it's only oriented to the liberation of the individual. And it only seeks the goal of being an arhat, which means one who is free of any kind of taint or contamination. But in order to understand the idea that this is possible, and this is again different from a god, one of you in the questions mentioned about Buddha and the gods, but this is different from the god, because a god is someone who, through generosity, morality, which means sensitivity to others and treating them properly, and then tolerance, not reacting angrily to abuse. Those are the three sort of self-opening things that make one rise in evolutionary forms and become eventually a god by some vast generosity and vast things like that. But their intelligence did not necessarily increase that. They do increase, but not that much really more than a human. And then the cushiness of the circumstances in the heavens that they achieve makes them hard to develop further as a god. So therefore, the human form is the best form to then develop the intelligence with which one attains true freedom by understanding the nature of the world and goes past, reaches the best possible thing you can think of in evolution, you could say. And when I say evolution, I say it meaningfully, because the Buddha did discover a kind of evolution. He rationalized it, which you didn't have. All you had before him in the Vedic thing was the gods and the humans and animals. And then if you did the Vedic sacrifice, you might get to be an ancestor, which is like a sort of intermediary place between the humans and the gods. And a few great ascetics and yogis could become gods. And they didn't really question whether the gods were permanent or eternal or not eternal. But obviously they were, the gods are like the Olympian gods, the Greek gods, and they have problems, and they have divorces, and they have wars, and they freak out, and they do immoral things. So there's kind of already a hint that they might be impermanent. You know, like, because they're created entities. And even the Upanishadic thinkers are aware of the difference between the created and the uncreated, and anything created by cause and condition then has the seeds of its own destruction or its own temporality, its own obsolescence are in it, and that they were not unaware of. So we have to see there, and then the other thing about, so the Buddha discovered that humans have been animals, animals become humans, humans have been in hell, hell beings come back up to human, humans have been gods, come back down to human. Every being has been everything, in other words. It's the idea. And which is like a kind of interwovenness. You know, when Darwin discovered this thing about the genes, there was this huge resistance, which still we see in fundamentalist parts of our society, to the idea that the human can be actually related to an animal. And then even we see in people who say they don't mind the genes being connected, they'll say, well, but only humans have minds and consciousnesses. You know, animals don't have souls, well, they don't want to have a soul, but at least animals don't have minds. It was like it's been a big freak out of the last 50 years, maybe. People doing chimpanzee, I don't know, typing the computer. What do? They play, they learn. The idea that they also have minds, you know, it's like a big breakthrough, you know, supposedly, you know, which is silly. That was totally known from thousands of years ago in Asia. And the sense of kinship with the animals, because of having been one, and them having been you, and them having souls and minds or whatever it may be, but suffering worse than you, has been normal for thousands of years. But the difference is, of the Darwinian one, is it's only the gene that evolves, and it creates new species, and you know, random mutation, right? And the human is like we're just an accident, we're just an instance of our species. And then if we are really particularly great in a lifetime as that instance of a species, it doesn't really affect the species because it's a random mutation, unless we somehow, you know, a lot of us do something successful, and then, you know, we have more children or something. But it's just there's no individual, in other words, fruition of whatever you do good, and no individual punishment or disfruition or you know, suffering coming from doing bad in the long run. Everybody's in the same place of not existing at death in the modern materialist one. But in this one, the individual inherits the effect of their actions in a life, and they evolve between different species as individuals, which is kind of interesting, actually. It's another myth. In a way, it's another myth, but it's an interesting myth. And actually, the up from Precambrian slime is a myth, actually. That's a myth. Nobody really knows that. And it's only on this planet, that's all. Who knows that? How many? Now they more and more. Oh, now there's like millions and zillions of humanoid, Earth-like planets where the moon is just right. Although, how amazing isn't it when any of you out in the eclipse? How amazing is it that the moon is 400 times smaller than the sun, but it's 400 times closer exactly, so they look exactly the same size? I mean, that's pretty weird, isn't it? But there might be, trillions of planets like that. And then humans are there with like their thing being deluded into thinking that the moon and sun are planets, which was the old view. They don't know about the 400 times different size. It's a really weird circumstance, planet we live on. But there are millions of them. And then we're the only humans, that like, Carl Sagan is sending out like Mozart and the Beatles. And with big, huge aerial, like cost $1 zillion out there waiting to see if they have Beatles too. Or they like Mozart, or whatever. It's kind of like, because we're so lonely in the universe. And then all these guys who become billionaires, they constantly, we're all going to Mars? I can't take it. I'm really sick of it. If anybody knows any of them, tell them that really, they got to come off it. The only person who ever went to Mars was Arnold Schwarzenegger in the movie Final Attack, or whatever it was. His eyes bugged out, and then he found he had an adventure there. This is totally silly. That's an excuse not to fix this place on the basis of despair that you can't. And of course we can, right? Didn't somebody run around and say, yes, we can? Not long ago, and then they didn't do enough. Anyway, never mind. I won't digress. I'm not going to digress. Okay, so this, but we have to understand the Buddhists think, they don't agree. That they do agree that if you just live instinctively and just grab what you can and do this and push people out of the way or whatever, you're going to have a negative evolution and you go round and round in the cycle, and it's kind of meaningless. Just like we're told that our life is ultimately meaningless. We're told that. That's supposed to be mature to accept that. That what you do doesn't matter. That you don't matter. That's supposed to be mature. You're grown up if you're like that. I'm sorry, you're psychotic if you're like that, not grown up. Psychotic. It means you're not responsible really for what you're doing because you're told it's meaningless. So you can be as bad as you can get away with and nobody will bother you, Like, what's his name won't have to stay in public housing forever. He'll get back to his golden triplex. He doesn't like that house, It's public housing, he doesn't want it. So he thinks it won't have any, he thinks that whatever he does won't have a consequence, you understand? He's taught that. That's what we're all taught in this university. If you're really hip and you know the natural science thing and you have science, STEM education, you get that. Never mind humanities, you don't really need that. That's for conversation and cocktail parties in between, getting promoted in your corporation. But if you think you're meaningless and useless and it's all just an accident and it might be the only such accident in the universe and it all ultimately means nothing, then it puts you in a depression, really, subconscious depression, and it makes you psychotically irresponsible and reckless. And why don't we fix the global warming? Everybody says, oh, because we're the frog in the hot water, we don't see the future consequence. We don't care about the future consequence because we won't be there. Did you notice in George Bush's memoir, or Woodward interviewed George Bush at one time, and he said, Mr. President, don't you worry about your great-grandchildren if they happen to live in polluted Texas? And people would say, well, when he was governor, that really turned things in the bad direction, and your great-great-grandfather really messed everything up. Don't you worry about that? He says, no, I don't worry about that. I won't be there, he said. So what do I care what they say about me? Okay? Now, that's a reckless kind of thing. I mean, he's cute. I think he's a cute person. But, no, he is. Dalai Lama likes him a lot. He likes him. They're born on the same birthday, but a different year. But he thinks he's more friendly than other politicians. And he is more jolly, But that poor guy has been miseducated, that what he does doesn't matter. Then the religious side, and it's all escaping from the thing about God and providence and morality, threatening you with hell and things like that. This materialist thing escapes from that. But there's a middle way between these things. And the middle way is what you do does matter. But it doesn't just matter to other people. It also matters to you because you don't get away by dying. That's what the Buddhists think anyway. So then, since that's the case, it's like if you're going to be here forever, the question of how you are going to experience being here becomes critical, doesn't it? As I told Rick Warren once in a joke, I said, well, you guys don't have many lifetimes to mess around like we do. I was representing Buddhism in a conference. Rick Warren was that fundamentalist in California who was in was that the Clinton? Or that was Obama's thing, I think. Obama's inauguration. People were annoyed because he's anti-gay and he's a weird fundamentalist, has a mega church, And I said, well, you guys are better than the materialists at least, because at least you have one life. I said, you don't have many like we do. I try lots of different things, but you have one. But one thing we can say about that one is it's really long. He really cracked up. I cracked him up with that. Good or bad, it's really long. He went, oh, ho, ho, ho. So this is the point. Now, all such theories, even the karma theory, which is an evolutionary theory, but it has a mythical quality. In other words, there's a wonderful caveat in Buddhist science, which is actually rather like modern science, that all theories about relative reality are contextual and relative. They are not absolute. So that's why when Carl Sagan asked the Dalai Lama rather, when Carl Sagan interviewed Dalai Lama and asked him, he said, well, Your Holiness, what would you do if we had a foolproof experiment and proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that there's no such thing as future life and reincarnation? What would you do? So the Dalai Lama looks thoughtful and he says, well, I would stop believing in it, no problem. And Sagan's jaw dropped, because this is a professional reincarnation he's talking to. He says, well, I wouldn't believe in it if you proved that it wasn't existing. I'd accept the proof, he said, the Dalai Lama said. So then Sagan was silenced for a minute, didn't know what to say. So then Dalai Lama says, okay, now how are we going to make that perfect experiment? Like rubbing his hands together, let's get on with it. And of course, there is no such experiment. And so Sagan was slightly taken or lost there. But he liked him, they had fun, But how you can't actually there is evidence. A lot of people remember previous lives, not to the extent that the Buddha did, but a lot of people do remember them, and there's a lot of evidence about it. And I'm not going to get into that exactly more today, but I just want to say that's what the Buddhists think, and they even are willing to say that someone could disprove what they're saying or they think, about the individual evolutionary trajectory of sentient individuals, which is basically their evolutionary theory, to all animal forms. So that in that respect, it resembles Darwin very, very much. And then similarly, so all theories about relative reality are contextual, merely relative, not absolute. The only sort of absolute theory, or rigorous one, you could say, provable rigorous one, is a negation of self, negation of emptiness, negation of an absolute in the relative, in other words, you could say, which is almost a tautology. It's almost so simple. In other words, how could my Bob Thurman soul or immortal self or fixed identity, how could that be absolute and yet be mine? In order to be possessed by me, it has to relate to me, right? If the core of me was an absolute, it would be irrelevant to me, because if it related to me in any way, it would no longer be an absolute. Do you follow me? That's called the royal reason of relativity. It's almost a tautology. It's the meaning of the word, And so therefore, that there is no relative absolute, in a way you could say, is as good as that is considered what they call definitive in meaning, and that's rigorous and logical and sort of can be proven, both by theory and experience, they say. And what that is not that the reality is a vast nothingness or some kind of empty space with no one in it, although people can have empty space experiences where everything seems to dissolve into empty space. In fact, we have everything dissolving experience every night when we fall asleep, all of us. We let go of the whole sense. Normally we connect to the world through our senses, and when we shut down our senses, we are gone. Of course, we can then reconstruct some kind of environment and a subjectivity in the environment in a dream. But the deep sleep, where we're unconscious, meaning unconscious through our senses, is like a dissolution of everything. So there are such experiences, but that's not the reality. Because just because you're sleeping doesn't mean trucks are not going up and down Broadway, type of thing, right? So So what emptiness is the total relativity of everything and of life form. So it's an infinite and perpetual, that is to say infinite in time as well as space, relativity of life forms, not any kind of nothingness, the selflessness and emptiness thing. It's the relativization of the self is what it is, what selflessness means. So therefore death itself is merely a quantum leap up or down in life as conscious living, not the opposite of life, but a gap in its continuum, just as a deep sleep, unconsciousness, is a gap in consciousness through the six senses. Do you follow? So you're all around, you're all there through your eyes and ears, and etc. And then you're just completely unconscious. You have no boundary, but you put yourself in a safe place, and then you fall asleep, or you try to and fall asleep, right? So that's the way they see the world, and even if they say, then this issue of the beginning of life, they argue that life is beginningless in two ways. One, relatively, it's beginningless because the idea of an uncaused cause or a first big bang out of nothing or something out of nothing is an incoherent idea, since nothing is not a place to be a source. It cannot be a source of something. Nothing isn't there. Nothing is actually nothing. Eureka. And so it's beginningless in the sense that it's always been going on. There's been that chicken, and that egg just goes on back, and ultimately also, in a way, in the sense that no functioning relational thing is ultimate. So ultimately, nothing is happening. When you want to pin anything down as if you pin its ultimate essence down, it will dissolve under your analysis before you find any essence, type of thing. This was also predicted from that ancient time, which quantum people have since discovered in the Heisenberg uncertainty principle and so on. And at a certain level of micro analysis, what you're analyzing disappears, and your mind gets involved, and there's nothing objective there, as they said in 1926, as they announced that discovery. And so ultimately, it's also beginningless in the sense that it hasn't begun, and it's not really happening. It's only unreally happening. This is like a dream state, what we're in their view. And it's unreal. It's not that it's non-existent. It exists, but it's unreally existing. It's illusory. It's like always something other than it seems. And we know that too, to a certain point. All of you. You've all been to your natural science courses. You have your Nat Sci curriculum stuff. And therefore you know that this here is a bunch of atoms zooming around, electrons and molecules and things. You have a face and skin and tables and things, but it's just all bzz. You know the joke about the physicist here at Columbia and worked on the Manhattan Project, particle physicist, who had a pair of snowshoes hanging on the thing in his lab. And then when we would come in, he would put on the snowshoes and he'd be working, doing his experiments, particle with particles and things. And then finally one of his graduate students said, Professor, why do you clank around here on the snowshoes? What's the problem? He said, well, when I get in here, my mind starts to think of things as just made up of these tiny particles zooming around, and I'm increasing my chances of not falling down into the subway, he said. I think it's funny anyway. Don't worry. Never mind. But the point is, we live with that. That's supposed to be the more real version of what's going on here, right? Because they did that with they have their electron cloud chambers and things. They know about atoms. But to us, we're just sitting happily here with our skin and our bodies and our skeletons and the wall and the floor, and that's real reality, we think. But it's unreal from the point of view of those deeper analysis of it, right? And of course, they resist the quantum discovery that when you really analyze it deeply, it disappears. Which doesn't mean that it's not here in this illusory way. It is. But it means that the way it's here is more illusory than we normally think. We think it's really real here. As one of my old teachers used to say, people are not wrong that they're real, but where they make a mistake is where they think they're really real. That's a mistake. We are actually unreally real. And when we know that, we are more relaxed about it, actually. It's actually healthy, supposedly. So anyway, to get out of it, so therefore, so what Buddha announces to people, and the foundation of the Buddhist double movement, I would say, I think, because a lot of you are asking questions about this religion, how do people do it, and how does it become a religion? There is a religious movement, But the religious movement is participated in by the people who can't participate in the main movement, which is the educational/scientific movement, which is a movement that, hey, I discovered that the human being has the capacity to understand him, her, itself completely, perfectly well. And not only that, but that's the one way they're really going to have a good time, is when they fully understand themselves and the world. And those are two shocking kind of things. But supposedly, a Buddha is a being who has succeeded in that. That's what a Buddha is. It's the ultimate evolutionary outcome, a perpetual state of perfect bliss, capable of being in many bodies, not just one body, or capable of being in a way no body, no recognizable ordinary body, just being pure blissful energy infused in everything, something like that. And become that way without destroying anything. It isn't that the Buddha destroyed the world or something. They destroyed suffering, seeing suffering as caused by a mistake. By correcting mistake, there's no suffering. But they didn't destroy anything useful, any people, any place or anything like that. They didn't go to a place that is resulting from the destruction of the ordinary world at all. So without destroying anything and loving everything and compassionate for all others, and then caught in a very strange bind, this evolutionary thing, supposedly, a Buddha. He's caught in this strange bind, which is shown by the fact that his enlightenment story, even in the Theravada version, in the sort of most ground level version, before he achieves this understanding of everything, this what they call the termination of contamination, including all energies and instincts in the unconscious, before that, he remembers infinite entanglement with every other being. He becomes aware of all of the destinies and the natures and the past and the evolutionary history of every other being, which is inconceivable. So therefore, the bind is that he feels he is every other being. He knows it all, not in a verbal sense of describe it, A, B, C, did here and there, but a sense of knowing, feeling how they feel, and experiencing their memories, even that are unconscious to them, supposedly, becomes omnipresent in that way, but therefore cannot avoid seeing that the beings don't think everything is great. They don't think it's nirvana. They think they're suffering, they're having a terrible time. So then what do we do with that? That's part of the reality. Even though it's a delusion and it's a mistake and it's ignorant, based on ignorance, they still feel that. And then if you become a Buddha, you feel that. So even in Theravada, they say Buddha's like a mother. Every being to a Buddha is like a mother, every being seems like the mother's only child, like he's the mother of all beings. And so he has to do something about them, to introduce them to what he's, he can say, just to be coy and to get the gods on his side, he can say, well, I'm not going to teach anybody because they wouldn't understand. Remember, you see that in the story. He says, oh, no, people won't get it. I'm going to hang out and relax. What can I do? I can't help them. They won't understand, he says. And then Brahma comes and shows him a vision of rainfall falling on different kinds of flowers, and each one reacting to it in some way where they absorb what they can, in other words. So then they, and pushing him and giving him the wheel of what they call the wheel of Dharma, meaning the wheel of teaching. So evolution, therefore, and then the human being, and then the other good thing about it is that the human being is the one who is closest to that evolutionary sort of summit, which is beyond the, Buddha's name, one of his names in the Theravada too, is Deva Manusyanam Shasta, which means teacher of gods and humans, not just humans, also gods. So he's not just a god, he's teacher of gods. And I think that was what I wanted to convey about what is a Buddha. Any question? Yeah, that's what I wanted to say, what a Buddha is. And so therefore in such a society where this sort of news is broadcast to people by someone who seems to have credibility, and even though he says, what I like is he says, this is inexpressible ultimately. All relative descriptions of relative processes and relative things can be contradicted, actually. They will not hold up under a rigorous analysis. It will disappear. But accept that statement. The negation of the ability of the conceptual, the small human conceptual mind to grasp reality in completeness, that is the one that's sort of rigorous, he says. So he's sort of saying that, everything's cool, I know it all, I'm happy, I'm cheery, everything's fine, I have long earlobes, but I can't really explain it to you. I can't. It's not like I can make a slogan or a creed, and if you believe it, then you will enjoy that. No, you have to come to understand it. That was the problem of Buddha. That's why I say it's a twofold movement. The ones who want to really take up that challenge and use their human life in that evolutionary way, they have to start an educational process. That eightfold path of the Four Noble Truths that we'll talk about next week is, in more detail, it's an educational curriculum. It's a core curriculum, you could say. And so those people are not really approaching it as a religion defined as a system of beliefs, because it doesn't depend on beliefs, it depends on experience and experiment, which means experiment in your mind and in the world, and investigating the world. And so they are approaching a sort of whole new education system, which is not an apprenticeship for a social profession that involves producing something and keeping the society going, driven by controlling desire, hate, and delusion, because of course societies have to somewhat control, or they have to have a shared delusion, first of all, that everybody agrees about, that is what's worthwhile doing and not doing, and then they can't have too much lust and they can't have too much hatred, or they will blow up, So they have to, they also, all societies have a kind of dharma, as they would say. Well, that's the meaning of dharma. Law is the meaning of dharma, custom, duty, and so on. That's a lower meaning, a less transcendent meaning of dharma. So then that's one, and then the others who, for whatever reason, they're not educated, they don't have that spark they don't get it, but they kind of like the people who do, what apparently happened, and then they feed them and they tolerate them, and the kings give them tax exemption and they give them exemption from military service, and for some time the patriarchs gave the women exemption from childbearing duties and washing and planting and weeding and cooking and harvesting duties, which is what they did in the agricultural society. And so they took care of them, actually. And then for them it was kind of a religion, because they believed that education system, in an era where there was no such thing as a Columbia University or Harvard University or Oxford University, or there wasn't even such a thing as a monastery either, they were sort of allowed these kind of things to pop up, which did not have immediate productive usefulness. In fact, on the contrary, took away their manpower from their armies, took away their woman power from their breeding, took away their service in the household and so forth. And so they gave up a lot of that stuff. And that's why it could happen in India 800 years before there was some kind of monasticism in the West, although under Christianity. And Buddhist monasticism could develop in China about 700-800 years afterwards, because those were much less wealthy environments, less populous and less surplus. In other words, you can give free lunch to people when you have surplus food and no icebox, no freezer to hoard it in. You might as well give it away before it rots. So this is the thing. So that's what a Buddha is. Did we get through that? I think so. Did we get through the time? I think so. Is it time for the weekend? No. Friday is still there. Take it easy. See you next Tuesday.